Hey guys, what's going on? Just going to talk about our readings for today. And we had readings from the book that talked about later in Nixon's presidency, as well as when Gerald Ford was president and when Jimmy Carter was president. And there was a article online that talked about 3 Mile Island and people's reactions to that. But the article I want to talk about was Nixon and what he wanted to do in terms of combating the energy crisis. In the early 1970s and I guess the late 60s, there was a war going on in the Middle East, and that kind of cut down our supply of oil, which at this point is kind of a turning point in our country's history, and we kind of build off of it. And with this war in the Middle East, Nixon predicts by the end of the month we'll be 2 million barrels of oil per day short of what the U.S. is at that moment when he gave that address. And he kind of had a multi-step plan, and his very first step was to prevent industries that were currently operating on coal that wanted to switch to oil from switching to oil, because that would leave up or free up more oil to be used by different organizations and different companies or different places that needed to use oil. I don't know. Another thing he did was he reduced the quantities of oil for fuel to be used in aircrafts. And they also cut back 10% of the flights. And they had to reschedule some arrival and departure times, which I could imagine would upset people. But I think at this point people realize, oh man, this is like a real legitimate issue, and I guess we can make that sacrifice if it means helping America. He also reduced 15% of oil meant for heating homes and businesses, and he actually recommended lowering the temperature in their home by about 6 degrees. At the time, most people's homes on average were about 74 to 78 degrees. And he actually said that his doctor, because everyone trusts their doctor, right? He said that his doctor told him that it's healthier for you to sleep, or live, I guess, in 66 to 68 degree if your house is that temperature instead of 75 to 78. And I guess that at the time people probably believed their doctor because there was no such thing as Google. There wasn't the internet. People would have to go ask their doctor if that was true, and that probably seemed like too much of a hassle, so they just believed Nixon. Nixon also made government cuts when it come to fuel, and at the time of the address he said they already made 7% of, or they already cut their fuel in the government by 7%, and he wanted all government cars, which at the time was about 500,000, to go no faster than 50 miles an hour, because in theory they would use less fuel. On top of that, he wanted to reduce highway speeds for all motorists to 50 miles an hour, and he said this could potentially save 200,000 barrels of oil per day. And I actually did a little bit of math. So if you guys want to hear a story, imagine you're going from Orange City, Iowa to Chicago, Illinois. Google Maps says that's an 8-hour drive. Well, 8 hours and 2 minutes, I rounded. And it's a 500-mile, 497 miles, I just rounded up, journey, meaning your average speed would be 62.5 miles per hour. Now, I'll just use my car for example. At 62.5 miles an hour, I get roughly 21 miles per gallon, which over that 500-mile journey would be 23.8, we'll just say 24 gallons of fuel. If your average speed was 50 miles per hour, that 500-mile journey would take you 10 hours, so an extra 2 hours. But I did the math, and reducing your average speed to 50 miles an hour would, in my car at least, raise my MPG to about 28, 29 miles per gallon, which on that trip I would then use about 16.8 or 17 gallons of fuel, which is a 7-gallon saving, which in turn doesn't seem like that much, because who's making a trip from Orange City to Chicago every day? Not a whole lot of people. So up front it may not seem like a lot, but when you counter in every single person that drives in big cities, in small rural areas, in all kinds of settings, it would add up. And back in the 60s and 70s, cars didn't get, 20 to 30 miles per gallon. You were lucky if the old family car got, 12 to 15 miles per gallon, which by today's standards seem pretty low. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But Nixon also wanted the Atomic Energy Commission to speed up the building of nuclear power plants from 10 years to about 6 years. He also asked for state and local governments to help, and he asked for every citizen to take action. They also wanted to return to daylight saving times on a year-round basis. And at the end of his address, Nixon said that in 7 days, the average American uses as much resources as most people use in a year, or citizens of other nations might use in a year. And he put it this way: the U.S. holds 6% of the world's population, yet we use 30, not 13, 30% of the world's energy. So when you tie that into today, going back to that fuel story, we've made cars more fuel efficient. I actually heard a proposal that it's like early in the 2020s, they want every car to average like 18 to 20 miles per gallon, which doesn't seem like that big of a deal because there's a lot of small cars that get, 30, 40, 50 miles per gallon. But then you have all these big pickup trucks that people drive around for fun that get, at best, 11, 12, 13 miles per gallon. So that's one thing that they've been doing to fight this issue in today's world. And I also like to think of it in terms of global warming. And I'm not going to put in my 2 cents of global warming because I'm sure you guys don't want to hear that. But we've done a lot in terms of renewable energy when it comes to wind, solar, and hydroelectricity, whether it be dams, whether it be wind turbines, whether it be solar panels. We've come up with new ways to create energy, so if something like, a war in the Middle East, like it's going on right now, or has been going on, who really knows, and we get our supply of oil cut short, we have something to fall back on. And another thing, the ozone layer was really weak in the late 70s, late 80s, or early 80s, and in hairsprays in the early 80s, or I guess prior to 1987, there was a chemical called CFC, or chlorofluorocarbon, and what this did for the ozone was basically destroy it. And scientists noticed over the Arctic that there was this spot, this opening, where sunlight was getting in. And what the ozone layer does is it stops UV rays from coming to Earth and interacting with humans. So they did some science and some research, and they figured out, hey, CFCs are bad for the ozone, and we kind of need the ozone. So in 1987, they banned CFCs, and from the time they banned it up to about 2015, they noticed the hole above the Arctic or Antarctic, I don't know, one of the poles, was shifting, and it wasn't shrinking, it was growing slightly, and it would always move around and change different positions. But they did notice last year, or within the last 2 years, that ozone hole has begun to shrink, and they think a lot of that's due to the fact that we banned CFCs 31 years ago. So if you think that it's taken 31 years for the ozone to heal, how long it would take for global warming to reverse. And some scientists think that global warming could be irreversible, and humans have already done enough damage to Earth, which is kind of upsetting because, we only have one Earth, so let's take care of it, right? But that's all I have for you guys today for the object lesson. I hope you, maybe expanded on your knowledge from one of our article readings for today. And I don't have a whole lot more to say. Thanks.